The late afternoon sun of Riverside, California, filtered through the lace curtains of Clara Donovan's small apartment on Cedar Avenue. Clara, 24 years old, had just returned from teaching her last class of the day at a nearby elementary school. She was a bright presence in her neighborhood, someone who could make anyone smile even on a gray day. Her students adored her, not just because she taught them to read or write, but because she truly saw them. She celebrated their birthdays, encouraged their shy voices, and read stories to them as if she were casting spells with her words. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Clara lived alone, a modest apartment on the second floor of a quiet brick building. The neighborhood was familiar to her. She knew every corner, every neighbor. On weekends, she visited her parents, Eleanor Donovan and Adam Reed, who lived a few miles away in a cozy house filled with photos of family trips, school achievements, and birthday celebrations. Clara's older sister, Sofia Delgado, often stayed for lunch when she could. Clara and Sofia shared a closeness born of trust, laughter, and secrets whispered late at night as children. December 14, 1974, started like any other winter day. Clara taught her students about the magic of stories, her voice calm yet lively. She reminded them to finish their holiday projects and promised her famous homemade cookies for anyone who tried their best. After school, she walked home with a few friends, stopping to chat with neighbors. She returned to her apartment with groceries, humming softly, unaware that this day would end in tragedy. Later that evening, someone was watching her. Someone who had noticed her routines, who had seen her warmth as a teacher, as a friend, as a person. David or Victor, whatever name he was using at the time, had studied her habits carefully. The apartment was quiet when he slipped in. Clara, trusting by nature, would not have imagined danger from someone who seemed polite, unassuming. When he entered, she greeted him with a nervous smile, not yet sensing the darkness that had followed her for weeks. The attack was swift, violent, and over before Clara could fully comprehend. She fought with everything she had, scratching at her assailant in desperate defense. She tried to scream, but the apartment was silent except for the muffled sounds of a struggle. In the end, Clara Donovan was strangled, then stabbed multiple times. Overkill, personal, a crime committed in anger and control, not just lust or theft. When the police arrived hours later, responding to a neighbor's call, they found her lifeless body on the living room floor. Her hands bore the marks of her resistance, her fingernails scraping against her killer. Her apartment was undisturbed otherwise, no signs of forced entry. She had let him in. Detective Julia Sanders arrived that night, a seasoned officer in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an intuitive understanding of human behavior. She surveyed the scene carefully. The apartment was small but orderly, the kind of home someone took pride in. The bed was neatly made, the kitchen still had the faint aroma of evening meals, and the living room was adorned with small personal touches, a knit blanket, a potted plant, a stack of books by the window. Julia knelt by Clara's body, noting defensive wounds, the pattern of the stabbing, the bruising around the neck. It was clear the victim had struggled. "Any witnesses?" Julia asked quietly, her notebook open. "None," a uniformed officer replied. "No forced entry. The neighbors didn't hear anything unusual until after the fact. It's weird." Julia frowned. She had seen enough violent crimes to understand that this was personal. The overkill, the scratches, the methodical attack. This wasn't random. This was someone who hated rejection, someone who wanted control. But there were no leads, no suspects, nothing beyond the immediate evidence. The investigation began in earnest. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed friends, colleagues, and neighbors. They scoured Clara's past, her relationships, her social circles, and anyone who had reason to harbor resentment. Yet, week after week, month after month, the trail ran cold. The killer had left no fingerprints, no hair, nothing that could be tied to him directly. The technology of the era was limited. DNA testing was decades away, and evidence that might one day be pivotal was stored in cardboard boxes in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department evidence locker. Sofia Delgado was left with grief she could hardly bear. She visited her sister's apartment once, lingering in every room, touching the books Clara had read, the photos she had taken. She tried to imagine her sister alive again, to recall her laughter, her gentle way of encouraging others. The holidays were unbearable. Family gatherings were overshadowed by Clara's absence. Eleanor Donovan and Adam Reed mourned quietly, their own sorrow compounded by helplessness, by the knowledge that the person who had taken their daughter remained free. Years passed. The case remained unsolved. Detective Julia Sanders retired eventually, leaving the force but never truly leaving the haunting memory of Clara's last day. The evidence sat in storage, waiting, forgotten by many, but not all. Sofia Delgado, meanwhile, carried her sister's memory like a torch. She told her mother she would not rest, that she would continue asking questions, seeking answers. But without new technology, there was little she could do beyond the occasional letter to the police department, occasional inquiries that went unanswered. It wasn't until 2019, decades later, that a new kind of hope emerged. DNA technology had advanced beyond anything the Riverside County Sheriff's Department could have imagined in 1974. Forensic genealogy was no longer the stuff of dreams or science fiction. Cold cases that had gone stagnant for decades were being reopened and solved. Families across the nation were finally getting answers. Sofia, now in her mid-60s, read an article about a case in another state, where decades-old evidence had been tested using DNA, leading to the arrest of a man who had killed 3 women in the 1980s. Her heart raced. Could it be? Could this technology finally bring Clara's killer to justice? Sofia began her advocacy quietly at first, calling old friends on the force, reaching out to retired detectives who remembered her sister. She found Detective Julia Sanders, now living in a small home near Riverside, tending her garden. Julia answered the call immediately, her interest piqued, her instincts still sharp. "You're serious," Julia said, her voice carrying decades of experience and sorrow. "You want to reopen your sister's case?" "I have to," Sofia said, voice steady. "I can't stop wondering, not even for a day. She deserves justice. We deserve answers." They began reviewing the old files. Julia pulled out yellowed reports, handwritten notes, crime scene photos, sketches, and the evidence log. Among the evidence was a small vial labeled fingernail scrapings, collected from Clara's hands, the scratches she had left on her attacker during the struggle. At the time, the science simply couldn't process it, but now it could. Sofia watched as Julia explained how DNA testing and forensic genealogy could help. We take what was collected then, compare it to modern databases, look for familial matches. Even a distant cousin could lead us to the perpetrator. It's incredible, but it works. The weight of decades of grief pressed down on Sofia. For 45 years she had imagined this moment, finally finding the person who destroyed her sister's life, who left a permanent void in their family. She envisioned confrontation, closure, and even justice. But there was a fragile uncertainty in it. What if the evidence had deteriorated? What if the case remained unsolved? Could a decades-old crime really be unraveled by modern science? Despite her doubts, Sofia and Julia carefully packaged the evidence for transfer to the University of California Riverside Genetics Lab, where forensic genealogist Dr. Emily Harper had agreed to take the case. Emily had a reputation for meticulous work, for never giving up, for finding connections where others saw dead ends. She understood the emotional weight of every sample, every scratch, every hair, every drop of blood preserved in a vial. The next few weeks were tense. Sofia called the lab daily, checking in, but the work had to proceed on its own timeline. Each day brought a mixture of hope and fear. The past seemed to whisper around her, Clara's laughter, her birthday wishes, her encouragement, all mingled with the silence of her absence. Sofia returned to her family home often, speaking to her mother Eleanor and Adam Reed about every detail she could remember, about every day leading up to Clara's death. Together, they sifted through memories and letters, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. Anything that could help modern investigators understand Clara, her life, and her interactions. They were determined that nothing, not even a forgotten conversation, would be ignored. Meanwhile, Riverside itself had changed. Streets were wider, buildings taller, and technology everywhere. But for Sophia, the city still carried the echoes of 1974, the quiet neighborhood, the apartment where her sister had laughed, the streets she had walked. It was both comforting and painful, the reminder of a life stolen too soon. And so, as 2019 drew on, the case that had seemed frozen in time for 45 years began to move once again. Old photographs were dusted off. Evidence vials were examined under bright laboratory lights. Julia Sanders took careful notes, connecting the methods of 1974 with the technology of today. And Sofia Delgado, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination, finally allowed herself to hope that justice, delayed for so long, might finally arrive. Because for Clara Donovan, it was never too late. And for Sophia, there would be no rest until the person who had taken her sister away was found. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department had been quiet for years. Cold cases sat in filing cabinets and storage rooms, collecting dust. Files that once represented frantic investigations now rested in silent obscurity, waiting for someone to care enough to reopen them. Detective James Monroe had spent his career on the department's violent crimes unit, but he had always had a soft spot for cold cases, especially those involving women who had been brutally murdered. When Sofia Delgado contacted the department in early 2019, asking about her sister Clara Donovan's 1974 homicide, Monroe was immediately intrigued. The murder of Clara Donovan had haunted her family for decades. Clara, 24 at the time of her death, had been a kindergarten teacher in Riverside, CA, beloved by her students and colleagues. Her apartment was filled with warmth, photos of friends, handmade crafts, stacks of books she loved. That December evening in 1974, she had been alone, preparing for the holidays. Someone had come into her life that night with malice. By the time Detective Julia Sanders and her team had arrived on the scene, it was already too late. Clara had been strangled, then stabbed repeatedly, her defensive wounds showing a struggle that was both personal and ferocious. Monroe pulled out the original evidence box from storage. Gloves on, he carefully opened it, inspecting the preserved DNA swabs that had never been tested. In 1974, technology was incapable of performing the kind of analysis that might have identified her killer. The swabs, wrapped in paper envelopes and labeled in Sanders' neat handwriting, had been untouched for decades. Monroe felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a cold case. This was a sleeping monster waiting to be uncovered. Monroe arranged a meeting with Dr. Patricia Weber, a renowned forensic genealogist working out of the University of California, Riverside Genetics Lab. Dr. Weber had gained national attention for her work connecting old DNA samples to living relatives using modern genealogical databases. The potential to finally bring closure to the Donovan family and perhaps prevent another tragedy was enormous. In the lab, the sterile smell of chemicals and plastic gloves hung in the air. Weber moved with precision, explaining her process to Monroe and Sophia, who had insisted on being present. "Detective," she said, holding up the swab labeled C. Donovan, fingernail scrapings, "we'll start by extracting the DNA from this sample. We'll then run it through our genealogical database to find distant relatives. From there, we can build family trees, narrow down potential suspects, and cross-reference with missing persons and known offenders." Sophia listened intently. She had grown used to the mix of hope and frustration that came with these investigations, but this was different. This time, she felt the possibility of answers. The room was quiet except for the hum of centrifuges and the faint tapping of keyboards. Weeks turned into months as Weber worked tirelessly. Each day, Monroe updated Sophia on the progress, sharing preliminary matches and theories. Finally, a breakthrough arrived. Weber had traced DNA connections through a series of distant cousins, building family trees that led directly to a man named Victor Hale. Hale, Monroe discovered, had lived in Riverside in the 1970s and had moved several times over the decades. He had a long employment history as an accountant, a quiet life that seemed unremarkable on the surface. But the evidence was undeniable. Hale's DNA matched the sample from Clara's fingernails. Monroe decided surveillance was necessary before an arrest. Hale had lived a seemingly normal life in Riverside since 2015, frequently visiting the local library, attending community meetings, and taking evening walks in the park. Monroe's team followed him discreetly, capturing footage of him leaving his home, interacting politely with neighbors, and even smiling at a child on the street. The contrast between this ordinary man and the horrific crimes he had committed decades ago was chilling. Monroe called Sophia to the operations room. "Sophia, I want you to see something," he said, showing her a photo from the surveillance footage. "This is the man who stole your sister from you, living quietly among us all these years." Sophia's hands trembled as she took in the image. Victor Hale's calm expression, his clean-cut appearance, and his unassuming demeanor made it impossible to reconcile with the violent, calculating killer who had murdered her sister. Her grief mingled with disbelief and rage. The team implemented the water glass scenario to obtain a fresh DNA sample without alerting Hale. A half-full glass of water, collected from his kitchen, provided the necessary evidence. When the lab results came back, the match was irrefutable. Monroe took a deep breath. The case, after 45 years, was ready to move forward. Armed with warrants, Monroe and his team moved to arrest Hale. Early one morning, as the sun crept over Riverside, officers approached his home. Hale opened the door, still in pajamas, confused and disoriented. "Mr. Hale, you are under arrest for the murder of Clara Donovan," Monroe said. There was a pause, a stunned silence, and then compliance. Hale did not resist. At the station, Hale was interrogated. He sat quietly, his hands clasped, staring at the floor. Monroe laid out the evidence, step by step. DNA match, surveillance, genealogical tracing. Hale's demeanor shifted. Eventually, he confessed to Clara's murder, describing the evening in chilling detail. He spoke of the rejection, the rage, the need for control. The confession was precise, corroborating the original investigation from 1974. Sophia felt a wave of emotion. Relief, sorrow, and anger collided in her chest. Justice, finally, was on the horizon. She left the station briefly to catch her breath, wandering through Riverside streets. It felt surreal. The same streets she had walked decades before with her sister, now serving as the backdrop for closure. Yet, Monroe reminded her that this was only the beginning. Hale's movements over the decades were not fully understood. Where else had he gone? Who else could have been affected? The discovery of his identity opened a Pandora's box of potential victims. Monroe began coordinating with cold case units across California, Michigan, and other states Hale had lived in. Files were pulled, evidence examined, and DNA samples retested. Meanwhile, Hale was booked and held in protective custody. Officers noted his calm, almost eerie composure, which sometimes gave way to muttering and isolated moments of anxiety. The city, oblivious to the decades-old crimes committed among them, had no idea that one of its residents was a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Back at the lab, Weber continued her work. She expanded the genealogical search, cross-referencing databases, building timelines, and comparing unsolved murders in cities Hale had passed through. The process was meticulous, exhausting, and slow. Each small breakthrough was met with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. The possibility of other victims weighed heavily on everyone involved. Sophia, though exhausted emotionally, refused to step back. She began compiling a list of cases that fit Hale's profile. Women aged 20-35, living alone, strangulation or stabbing as cause of death, defensive wounds present. Each case she examined brought with it the echo of her sister's suffering, the faces of women frozen in tragic circumstances, the grief of families who had waited decades for answers. Monroe pulled her aside one evening. "Sophia, your work is invaluable, but we have to be methodical. Each connection has to be airtight before we proceed. This isn't just about Clara anymore. This is about ensuring justice for all potential victims." Sophia nodded, understanding the gravity. The emotional toll was immense, but the resolve was stronger. She thought about Clara every night, imagining what her sister would say if she could witness this investigation. Clara would have wanted every truth uncovered, every killer held accountable. As the first year of the investigation came to a close, a meeting was convened between Monroe, Weber, and Riverside County District Attorney Grace Lee. Evidence, genealogical findings, and potential leads were presented. Lee stressed the need to proceed carefully, aware of the high-profile implications. "This case will attract media attention," she said. "Every step must be documented, every procedure flawless. But we cannot lose sight of the human element. We owe this to Clara, and to anyone else who may have suffered at Hale's hands." Sophia stayed late at the department, reviewing old photos of Clara. Each image told a story. Clara baking cookies for neighborhood children, reading to her kindergarten class, laughing with friends, sharing secrets with Sophia. The memories strengthened her resolve. She would see this through. She would not let the decades of silence be the final word. Meanwhile, Hale sat in his cell, confronted with the reality of his past. His calm facade fractured in private moments, mutterings to himself echoing off the concrete walls. For the first time in decades, the careful control he maintained over his outward persona crumbled. Detective Monroe began preparing for the next steps. The arrest and confession of Hale for Clara's murder were monumental, but the investigation into other potential victims loomed. Cold cases across multiple states were re-examined, evidence boxes reopened, DNA samples retested. A nationwide effort had begun, quietly, methodically, with the promise that no victim would be forgotten. Sophia knew this was only the beginning. Each day brought new leads, new possibilities, and the creeping realization that Clara's murder might be part of something far more sinister. And yet, hope was tangible. The long-dormant case had finally been revived. The name of Clara Donovan, whispered in quiet conversations for decades, was now a rallying cry for justice. By the end of 2020, Victor Hale was formally charged with Clara Donovan's murder. The arrest had brought a sense of closure, but the investigation continued. Monroe and Weber's work laid the foundation for what would become a multi-state inquiry into Hale's criminal history. Evidence was meticulously logged, family members contacted, and the possibility of connecting Hale to other cold cases became more than speculation. Sophia, standing outside the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, felt a weight lift slightly. It had taken 46 years, but Clara's story was no longer forgotten. The DNA evidence, the genealogical tracing, the relentless pursuit of truth had combined to finally unmask the man who had stolen her sister from the world. And though the road ahead promised further heartbreak and discoveries, the path toward justice had begun. The story of Clara Donovan, once a cold case gathering dust, had been revived. One detective, one genealogist, and one sister determined to uncover the truth had shattered decades of silence. But as Sophia would soon learn, the revelation of Victor Hale's identity was only the first step in uncovering the full extent of his crimes. The investigation that began with Clara would soon stretch across state lines, connecting decades of unsolved murders and offering hope to families long denied closure. And so, with the DNA confirmed, the arrest made, and the first confession in hand, the stage was set for a much larger investigation, one that would reveal the terrifying scope of Victor Hale's murderous life and forever change the lives of those who sought justice for the victims. The arrest of Victor Hale in Riverside had been a seismic moment for Sofia Delgado and her family. 46 years of unanswered questions had suddenly shifted into the tangible reality of a man in custody. Yet the sense of closure was tempered by the gnawing suspicion that Clara Donovan was not his only victim. Detective James Monroe had sensed it from the moment Hale's DNA was confirmed. The methodical nature of his crime, his mobility, and his meticulous avoidance of detection suggested a pattern, a history that stretched beyond Riverside. Weeks after the arrest, Monroe convened a meeting with Dr. Patricia Weber at the UC Riverside Genetics Lab. The lab had become a hive of activity, with technicians running tests on every viable DNA sample from Hale's past locations. Weber spread out multiple files across the table, each containing evidence from decades-old cold cases in Oakland, Chicago, Akron, and Dayton. "Detective," Weber said, pointing to the first folder, "we've cross-referenced Hale's DNA with samples from unsolved murders in each city he lived or visited. The preliminary results are significant." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. We have multiple matches. 4, to be exact, in addition to Clara Donovan. Sophia's heart skipped. She had feared this moment, had known logically it was possible, but the emotional impact was overwhelming. Monroe placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll take it one step at a time, but yes, it seems Victor Hale's reach was far wider than we initially realized. The first case they examined was Naomi Lynn, a 25-year-old graduate student murdered in Oakland, California, in 1977. Naomi had been studying biochemistry at a local university, known for her brilliance and her dedication to helping underprivileged students. Her apartment had been found in disarray, a clear struggle having taken place. Like Clara, Naomi had shown signs of defensive wounds, scratches and bruises consistent with a violent altercation. Next was Vanessa Torres in Chicago, Illinois, in 1982. Vanessa had been a nurse at a local hospital, beloved by colleagues and patients alike. Her life had been devoted to others, and she had been living independently when she was killed. The details mirrored Hale's previous crimes: strangulation followed by stabbing, a calculated attempt to eliminate evidence. Leah Bryant in Akron, Ohio, had been murdered in 1987. Leah, a social worker, had dedicated her life to helping victims of domestic abuse. Her death had left a community reeling. Finally, Hannah Park in Dayton, Ohio, in 1991, a young schoolteacher, had been found with her hands raised in self-defense, her apartment showing signs of forced entry and struggle. Monroe and Weber carefully reviewed each case file, noting the striking similarities. The forensic evidence, the victim profile, and the modus operandi all aligned with Victor Hale's methods. It was chilling. A pattern that spanned more than a decade, stretching across states, showing a cold, meticulous, and calculated predator at work. Meanwhile, Sophia coordinated with the families of these victims. She contacted Naomi Lynn's parents in Oakland, Vanessa Torres' mother Rosa in Chicago, Leah Bryant's father Ethan in Akron, and Hannah Park's mother Naomi in Dayton. Each conversation was emotionally taxing. Each family member had been waiting decades for answers, struggling with the absence of justice, living in the shadow of grief. When Sophia explained the breakthrough, the reactions were a mixture of shock, disbelief, and cautious hope. Tears flowed, hands shook, and voices wavered as she recounted the DNA matches, the arrest, and the ongoing investigation. "We have Victor Hale in custody," she said gently. "Your loved ones were not forgotten. Finally, we have answers." In Chicago, Vanessa Torres' mother, Rosa, sobbed uncontrollably. All these years I wondered who did this to my daughter. I never stopped hoping, and now we finally know." Leah Bryant's father, Ethan, echoed the sentiment in Akron. "It's been 34 years of wondering, of imagining the worst, of blaming ourselves for not seeing the signs. But at least now, there's some justice." Monroe knew that these families had been living with an unbearable burden, a void that no words could fill. But the DNA evidence provided clarity, irrefutable proof that the man responsible for their daughter's deaths was finally in custody. Weber worked tirelessly, confirming the matches, documenting the evidence meticulously. Each result strengthened the prosecution's case, each match a lifeline of closure for grieving families. The media caught wind of the multi-state investigation. Journalists called, reporters sought interviews, and the story of Victor Hale, a man who had eluded capture for decades, spread rapidly. Headlines highlighted the shocking reach of his crimes. Serial killer unmasked after 45 years. DNA brings justice across states. Families of cold case victims find answers. Despite the attention, Monroe and Sophia remained focused on their mission. Publicity could wait, the victims could not. As the investigation continued, Hale was brought in for additional questioning. He remained calm, almost eerily composed. Monroe and Weber confronted him with the new DNA matches. Hale initially denied involvement, insisting Clara Donovan had been his only victim. But Weber was methodical, presenting the genetic evidence linking him to Naomi Lynn, Vanessa Torres, Leah Bryant, and Hannah Park. Hale's composure cracked slightly when confronted with the truth. His hands trembled, his eyes darted nervously. I only... he stammered. Monroe's voice was steady but firm. "Victor Hale, the evidence is overwhelming. Every test, every match confirms your involvement. You cannot deny this." The confessions were partial, reluctant, and coldly detached, but they provided crucial details that corroborated decades-old investigations. Hale's recollections of each murder, combined with the forensic evidence, gave prosecutors the material needed to build a compelling case. Monroe and Sophia shifted their focus to trial preparation. The district attorney, Grace Lee, convened a team of investigators, forensic specialists, and legal experts. They combed through every file, reviewed every witness statement, and documented every DNA match. The goal was clear: a rock-solid case that would withstand any scrutiny and ensure Hale's conviction. Sophia continued to act as a bridge between the families and the investigation. She organized support groups, coordinating video calls and in-person meetings. Families shared memories of their daughters, photographs, letters, and keepsakes, creating a tapestry of life interrupted. Naomi Lynn's father, Michelle, spoke of his daughter's intelligence and compassion. "She wanted to change the world," he said, his voice breaking, "and someone took that from her." Vanessa Torres's mother, Rosa, described her daughter's dedication to her patients, her warmth, and the small acts of kindness that had defined her life. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2021. It would be the first of multiple proceedings to hold Hale accountable for his crimes. Prosecutors prepared exhibits, witness lists, and forensic analyses, carefully building a narrative that was both factually precise and emotionally compelling. DNA evidence would form the backbone of the case, but family testimony would give it heart and human weight. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Monroe and Weber continued their investigation, re-examining additional cold cases that fit Hale's profile. Each lead was meticulously documented, each potential victim treated with the utmost respect. The scope of Hale's crimes had become terrifyingly clear: one man, spanning decades, leaving a trail of grief and loss in his wake. Sophia spent long nights at the department, reviewing old photographs of her sister Clara, cross-referencing dates, locations, and potential links to other cases. The emotional strain was immense, but so was her determination. She had promised Clara, decades ago, that the truth would not be forgotten. Now, that promise extended to Naomi, Vanessa, Leah, Hannah, and potentially others yet unidentified. On the eve of the trial, Monroe called a final briefing. "Tomorrow, we go to court not just for Clara Donovan, but for all the women Victor Hale has harmed. Every piece of evidence, every DNA match, every family statement, it all matters. We owe it to them." Weber nodded, her notes meticulously prepared, charts of genealogical trees ready to display in court. Sophia took a deep breath, looking at the photographs of the victims laid out on the conference table. Each face a life lost, each name a story. The first trial would be monumental, a culmination of decades of work, a testament to modern forensic science, and an emotional reckoning for families who had waited far too long. The courtroom would be filled with journalists, family members, detectives, and legal teams. The stakes were immense, but so was the potential for closure. Sophia left the department that evening and walked through Riverside's quiet streets. The air was crisp, the city calm, but in her mind, the echoes of past tragedies reverberated. She thought of Clara, of Naomi, of Vanessa, Leah, and Hannah. They had all deserved better. They had all deserved justice. And finally, after decades of silence, they would receive it. Monroe and Weber continued their preparations, running simulations, reviewing evidence, and rehearsing witness examinations. The trial would be their first opportunity to present the magnitude of Hale's crimes, to show the jury that these were not isolated incidents, but a clear pattern of calculated violence spanning decades. Sophia, in private moments, reflected on the families she had spoken to. The pain in their voices, the tears shed quietly, the decades of unanswered questions, all of it fueled her resolve. She had become not just a sister seeking justice for Clara, but an advocate, a connector, a catalyst for closure across state lines. She spent long nights reviewing notes, photographs, and old case files, preparing herself for what was to come. Calls with families spanned hours, each conversation a delicate balance of comfort, encouragement, and preparation for the emotional toll ahead. She offered guidance, shared updates from the forensic teams, and reminded them that while the path ahead would be painful, they would finally confront the man who had stolen their loved ones. Sophia's thoughts often drifted to Clara. She pictured her sister laughing with neighbors, helping children with homework, hosting Sunday dinners. Those memories strengthened her resolve. "I will make sure your story is heard," she whispered to the quiet of her apartment, a vow carried over decades of grief. By late 2020, the prosecution had finalized their case. The jurors were selected, motions filed, and the schedules set. Every detail had been checked, every piece of evidence meticulously organized. The families were ready, though nerves lingered like a shadow over hope. Sophia looked out the window of her Riverside home, the California sunset painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The calm of the evening contrasted sharply with the storm of anticipation inside her. She knew that in the coming weeks, decades of silence, uncertainty, and grief would converge in a single place: the courtroom. She took a deep breath, clutching the photograph of Clara she had carried for 45 years. This was more than a trial. It was the culmination of a lifetime of unanswered questions. And while the path ahead would test them all, Sofia Delgado was determined. Justice would not be delayed any longer. The courtroom in Grand Rapids was heavy with anticipation the morning the trial began. Victor Hale, seated at the defendant's table, looked older than his years suggested. The decades of living with his crimes hidden weighed heavily on him, yet there was a calmness in his expression, a strange detachment that unsettled those in the gallery. Prosecutor Vanessa Lane stood at her table, folders stacked in front of her, each one containing the evidence painstakingly compiled by law enforcement and forensic teams over months of preparation. Across from her, defense attorney David Fields meticulously adjusted his tie, trying to project confidence to a jury that already seemed predisposed against his client. Sofia Delgado sat in the front row with the families of the other victims. Naomi Lynn, Vanessa Torres, Leah Bryant, and Hannah Park sat together, holding photographs, letters, and memories of their loved ones. The room was tense. For nearly 5 decades, these families had lived with uncertainty, grief, and unanswered questions. Today, they finally had a chance to confront the man who had stolen so much from them. Judge Richard Thornton entered, his robe flowing behind him, a figure of authority who had presided over countless trials. He called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Vanessa Lane delivered the opening statement. Her voice was steady, controlled, yet carried an undercurrent of emotion. She detailed the crimes, starting with Clara Donovan in Riverside, then progressing through the other victims in Oakland, Chicago, Akron, and Dayton. Each case was carefully outlined, emphasizing the commonalities: the method of attack, the defensive wounds, the calculated movements, and most importantly, the DNA evidence that tied them all to Victor Hale. "The DNA does not lie," Vanessa said firmly. "For decades, these families have been left in darkness. For decades, their loved ones' killers went undetected. Today, that darkness ends. Victor Hale will face justice for every life he has taken." David Fields rose for his opening. He tried to frame Victor as a normal man, a citizen who had lived quietly for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the evidence may appear convincing, but remember, DNA is only a tool. It is not the story. It cannot capture the full life of a man who has never been proven guilty in a court of law until today." The courtroom murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. The contrast was stark. The families knew the stories, knew the heartbreak, knew the fear that had haunted their nights for decades. The jury would hear the science, but they could not ignore the human cost. The forensic experts were called first. Dr. Patricia Weber had traveled from California to testify. She explained patiently and clearly the DNA process, the genealogical methods used to identify Victor Hale. "We used distant relative matches to build a family tree, tracing Victor Hale through generations of descendants. Once we narrowed our focus, we obtained a direct sample under legal surveillance. The match was conclusive. His DNA was found at every crime scene. She detailed the testing methods, the precautions taken to ensure chain of custody, and the statistical likelihood of error, a minuscule fraction of a percent. The jury listened intently, occasionally whispering to each other, their pens flying across notepads. Outside of court, news reporters live-streamed portions of the trial, capturing the national attention that had followed Victor Hale since his arrest. After the scientific testimony, the families took the stand. Sofia Delgado was first. She clutched a photograph of her sister Clara Donovan, her fingers trembling as she held it close to her chest. "Clara was the light of our family," Sofia began, her voice breaking but steady. She taught kindergarten, loved her students, baked cookies for neighbors, volunteered at the soup kitchen. She had a heart that wanted to help everyone. And you, Victor Hale, you stole that from us. She looked directly at him, though he did not return her gaze. For 45 years we lived with not knowing. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone, you were out there living your life while we suffered. Today, we see you for what you are. A killer. Nothing more, nothing less. Naomi Lynn's mother, May Lynn, testified next. She described her daughter, a bright student, volunteering at local charities, planning a future as a teacher. May Lynn's hands shook as she held a photo of Naomi in her high school graduation robe. "She called me every Sunday without fail," May Lynn said. "Every Sunday until she didn't, until you took her life. I've carried that silence for decades. Today, I want you to know that silence has ended." Vanessa Torres' father, Ricardo Torres, followed. "Vanessa was kind, beautiful, and full of life," he said. "You took her away in a way that we didn't understand for 30 years. 30 years of questions, fear, and sorrow. You will not take anything more from us. You will not hide behind your age or your history. You will face the consequences." Leah Bryant's sister Hannah spoke next. "I remember the day we learned," she said softly. "The phone call, the disbelief, the grief that has never left me, the fear that he was still out there. Now, I finally get to see that fear confronted, and I finally see justice served." Hannah Park's father, Michael, delivered the final statement for the families. "You did not just kill our daughters, you killed pieces of us too. We have carried the pain for decades, but today we watch as justice prevails." The prosecution rested, and the defense had its turn. David Fields attempted to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, arguing contamination, chain of custody errors, and alternate explanations. But every objection was met with precise refutation by the prosecution, supported by the lab reports and expert testimony. Victor Hale did not testify. He remained stoic, his hands folded in front of him. Occasionally, he glanced toward the families, but there was no expression, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives he had taken. The jury watched him closely, weighing the evidence against the man seated before them. Cross-examinations were brief but tense. Questions about his whereabouts, his work history, and his interactions with each victim were probed. Fields tried to humanize him, to remind the jury of his decades-long quiet life, but the narratives of the families and the irrefutable scientific evidence overshadowed his efforts. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The tension outside the courtroom was palpable. The families huddled together, sharing whispered words of encouragement, memories, and quiet tears. Each day of deliberation felt like an eternity, but the process was meticulous. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every DNA report had to be weighed. Finally, on the 7th day, the jury returned. The bailiffs called the courtroom to order. One by one, the jurors rose. The foreperson cleared her throat and spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. Count 1, murder of Clara Donovan, guilty. Count 2, murder of Naomi Lynn, guilty. Count 3, murder of Vanessa Torres, guilty. Count 4, murder of Leah Bryant, guilty. Count 5, murder of Hannah Park, guilty. Count 6, murder of Felicia Chen, guilty. Count 7, murder of Gabriel Reed, guilty. Count 8, murder of Isabel Kim, guilty. Count 9, murder of Veronica Delgado, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Tears flowed freely. Families embraced, sobbing, their decades-long grief finding a momentary release. Sofia Delgado clutched her sister's photograph to her chest, trembling but smiling through her tears. Naomi Lynn's mother wept openly, leaning on Vanessa Torres' father for support. Leah Bryant's sister and Hannah Park's father held hands tightly, sharing the relief and finality of justice. Victor Hale showed no reaction. He did not flinch, did not blink, did not speak. The bailiffs moved to escort him out, and he rose slowly, still calm, still distant. Judge Richard Thornton banged the gavel, restoring order. He scheduled the sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving the families a short reprieve but promising the final reckoning. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was again full. The families wanted to speak, they needed to speak. Judge Thornton allowed it. One by one, they recounted their experiences, the pain of losing their loved ones, the years of uncertainty, and the relief at finally knowing the truth. Sofia Delgado was first. She spoke about Clara, about the life she had lived, about the void left in the family. "Victor Hale," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "you took my sister, but you did not take our hope. You cannot erase her memory. We will never forget her. We will never forget the others. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars where you belong." May Lynn described the loss of Naomi Lynn. "For 40 years, I have carried the weight of not knowing. Today, I am lighter. I am still grieving, but I am not powerless. You are powerless. You cannot hurt us anymore." Ricardo Torres, Hannah, and Michael shared similar sentiments: pain, sorrow, defiance, and the satisfaction that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. Judge Thornton then addressed Victor Hale. His voice was measured, authoritative. "Victor Hale, you have been found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. Your crimes are heinous, calculated, and intentional. The evidence is overwhelming. You are a serial killer whose actions caused irreparable harm to 9 families. The court sentences you to 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. You will die in prison. Justice has been served." The gavel came down. Victor Hale was led away in chains. He did not look back. Outside the courtroom, the families breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the emptiness remained. They had answers, they had justice, but they had lost years, moments, and love that could never be restored. In prison, Victor Hale's health deteriorated rapidly. The strain of confinement, age, and disease took its toll. Diabetes, heart disease, and early-stage dementia limited his mobility. He spent most of his days in the infirmary, isolated, muttering apologies to no one, calling out names of his victims in fragmented whispers. He was haunted by the ghosts of the women he had killed. By early 2023, Victor Hale suffered a massive stroke. He was rushed to the prison hospital, but it was too late. He died 3 days later at the age of 76, alone, his crimes and his punishment complete. Maria Santos, the forensic genealogist who had helped link Victor Hale to the murders, called Sofia Delgado with the news. Relief and sorrow mixed in Sofia's heart. Justice had been achieved, but it had come at a cost no one could fully comprehend. She reached out to the other families. Each shared a similar complicated sense of closure. Outside the walls of Wayne County Jail, the sun shone on a crisp winter day. It was symbolic in its own way, light returning after long darkness. The families vowed to remember their loved ones, to honor their lives, and to continue advocating for justice in the name of those who could no longer speak for themselves. The trial had ended, the sentences imposed, the killer gone. Yet, the work of remembrance, advocacy, and bringing hope to other families was just beginning. The story of Clara Donovan, Naomi Lynn, Vanessa Torres, Leah Bryant, Hannah Park, Felicia Chen, Gabrielle Reed, Isabel Kim, and Veronica Delgado would not end in the courtroom. It would continue in the actions of those who refused to let their memories fade, who refused to let injustice linger in the shadows of time. Sofia Delgado returned home to Riverside, carrying with her a renewed determination. The fight for cold cases, for the unsolved, for families still waiting, was far from over. Victor Hale was gone, but his victims' stories were now permanent, their legacies secured, and their lives honored. The courtroom, the prison, the families' homes, All were silent witnesses to the conclusion of decades-long pain, but they were also the starting point for something greater: advocacy, hope, and the promise that no case would ever remain unsolved if justice could be served. And so, as winter faded and the first hints of spring began to stir, Sofia Delgado began planning the next steps: a foundation, a support network, a movement. From the tragedy and loss had emerged purpose. The fight for justice, once a personal crusade, was now destined to touch countless others. The shadows of the past were beginning to give way to the light of action. And as Sofia looked toward the horizon, she knew that the journey of remembrance, resolution, and reform was only just beginning. As the first hints of spring unfurled across Riverside, the cherry blossoms in the small community garden near Clara Donovan's old apartment swayed gently in the breeze, petals drifting lazily to the ground. For Sofia Delgado, the courtroom battles were behind her, and Victor Hale was gone, but the shadows he left lingered in the hearts of families across multiple states. The crimes were closed in court, the verdict delivered, and the sentences imposed. Yet Sofia knew that justice was not only about punishment, it was about remembrance, about ensuring that the stories of Clara, Naomi, Vanessa, Leah, Hannah, Felicia, Gabrielle, Isabel, and Veronica lived on, and that their lives, vibrant and full of promise, were never forgotten. Spring brought with it a sense of renewal, a promise that life could grow even in the wake of devastating loss. Sofia walked through Riverside Memorial Park, where a plot of land had been designated for 9 cherry blossom trees, one for each of the women Victor Hale had murdered. She knelt at the site, brushing soil around the roots of the first tree, the memory of her sister Clara flooding her mind. It had been nearly 50 years since Clara's life had been stolen, and yet here Sofia was, planting a living memorial that would bloom every spring as a symbol of hope and resilience. Soon, representatives from each of the other families arrived, carrying photographs, mementos, and memories of their loved ones. Naomi Lynn's mother, May Lynn, brought a small framed photo of her daughter in a school uniform, smiling widely. Vanessa Torres's father, Ricardo Torres, held a bouquet of daisies, Vanessa's favorite flower. Hannah Bryant's sister Hannah brought a handwritten note filled with recollections of laughter, music, and moments that defined her sister's life. Each family contributed in their own way, planting trees, scattering petals, and sharing stories aloud, creating a moment that was both somber and beautiful. Sofia spoke to the gathered families. Her voice was steady, filled with emotion yet tempered with the resolve that had driven her since the day Clara was killed. These trees are more than just memorials. They are reminders that life, love, and justice endure. For decades, we waited. We suffered in silence. Today, we honor not only the women we lost, but the lives they led, the people they were, and the light they brought into the world. Let these blossoms be a promise that their stories will never fade. The planting ceremony concluded with a moment of silence. The families held hands, eyes closed, reflecting on grief, loss, and the enduring connection that bound them. The gentle wind stirred the petals above, as though carrying messages from the women they had lost. Sofia felt Clara's presence more keenly than ever, a quiet affirmation that this work, this dedication to remembrance and justice, was only just beginning. With the memorial in place, Sofia shifted her focus to what had been her personal mission for decades, ensuring that no family would have to endure the same years of uncertainty she had. She began conceptualizing the Clara Donovan Cold Case Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families of victims, funding forensic genealogy research, and advocating for the use of modern DNA technology in unsolved cases. Her vision was clear: create a national network of resources that could bring closure to families, no matter how much time had passed. By mid-spring, the Foundation's headquarters were established in Chicago. The office was modest but filled with energy and purpose. Walls were adorned with photographs of solved cases, notes from grateful families, and timelines tracing investigations from initial crime to resolution. Sofia recruited Maria Santos, the forensic genealogist whose tireless work had been crucial in connecting Victor Hale to multiple murders. Maria's reputation as a meticulous investigator and her deep empathy for victims' families made her the perfect partner for this ambitious project. Together, Sophia and Maria began assembling a team: analysts to digitize old case files, investigators skilled in both traditional police work and genealogical methods, and victim advocates to guide families through the often painful process of revisiting old wounds. They established protocols for handling evidence, ensuring that chain of custody procedures were flawless and that ethical considerations around privacy were rigorously upheld. Each case became a story, each file a potential path to justice. The Foundation's first challenge came quickly: a 1985 cold case from Portland, Oregon. Christine Parker, a nurse whose body had been discovered in her apartment, had remained unidentified in the police records for decades. Using a combination of genealogical analysis, DNA testing, and investigative legwork, Sophia and Maria's team traced distant relatives and finally secured a match. The family was notified, and the relief was palpable. 44 years of unanswered questions suddenly transformed into closure. News of the Foundation's success spread rapidly. Media outlets ran stories highlighting the innovative use of DNA and genealogy to solve cold cases. Families from across the country reached out, desperate for assistance. Sophia and Maria were inundated with inquiries, each one representing decades of grief, longing, and hope. Every case, every family reinforced the mission. No matter how much time had passed, justice was possible. Sophia's advocacy work extended beyond investigations. In Washington, D.C., she testified before congressional committees, alongside Maria and several families whose cases had been solved. Senator Daniel Brooks, a longtime supporter of forensic science funding, listened intently as Sophia detailed the enormous backlog of unsolved murders, the technological advances that made solving them possible, and the emotional and societal impact of delayed justice. "Miss Delgado," Senator Brooks said, leaning forward, "the work you and your team are doing is extraordinary. What you're proposing, a national cold case task force with dedicated funding for DNA testing and forensic genealogy, how feasible is it?" Sophia spoke with the authority of both personal experience and professional expertise. "Senator, the technology exists, the methods exist. What we need is the support to apply them systematically. Thousands of families are waiting. Generations have suffered. Every dollar allocated to cold case investigation brings us closer to closure, to justice, and to preventing future harm." Her testimony resonated. The congressional hearings led to the Cold Case Justice Act, which allocated federal funding for forensic genealogy research, DNA testing, and training programs for investigators. The Foundation received a 3-year grant that allowed them to expand, hire more genealogists, and partner with law enforcement agencies in 12 states. By summer, the Foundation had grown exponentially. Offices buzzed with activity, investigators traveling across the country, reviewing cold cases from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Each solved case became a story of hope. Families who had given up were suddenly contacted with answers, their decades-long silence replaced with understanding, closure, and sometimes the first steps toward healing. Sophia continued to visit Riverside Memorial Park. Each visit was a reminder of why she had started this journey, of the sisters she had lost, and of the countless families still waiting. She brought flowers to the cherry blossom trees, sometimes sitting quietly on the bench, recounting the progress of the Foundation, the cases solved, the lives impacted. She would whisper to Clara, recounting each solved mystery, each face returned to their loved ones. "We're doing it, Clara. We're giving them answers. Your legacy is alive." Autumn arrived, and with it came the annual remembrance ceremony. Families who had found closure gathered, not just to mourn, but to celebrate lives remembered and justice achieved. Sophia spoke at the event, her words carrying both grief and hope. "We plant trees, we tell stories, we solve cases, and we honor the lives lost. Each solved case is proof that we can change the narrative, that time does not diminish truth, and that justice is not bounded by decades or distance." Maria Santos addressed the gathered families as well, describing the technical breakthroughs that had allowed cold cases to be solved. Genealogy is more than family trees, she said. It's a bridge from the past to the present, a way to give names back to the lost and voices back to the silenced, and with your support, this work can continue, reaching every corner of the country. By the end of 2023, the Clara Donovan Cold Case Foundation had solved 73 cold cases, returning answers to families who had suffered for decades. New cases continued to pour in: missing persons from Alaska, Jane Does from Nevada, unsolved murders in Maine and Illinois. Every investigation was treated with the same meticulous care, balancing scientific precision with human compassion. Sophia's dedication never waned. Each day, she rose early, reviewed case files, strategized with Maria, and spoke to families who needed reassurance and guidance. Every phone call, every email, every meeting reinforced the purpose that had defined her life since Clara's murder. She understood that the fight for justice was not a sprint. It was a marathon, a lifelong commitment that required resilience, empathy, and unwavering focus. As December approached, marking the 49th anniversary of Clara Donovan's murder, Sophia returned to Riverside Memorial Park. The cherry blossoms were bare, yet their branches reached skyward, a symbol of potential and renewal. She sat on the bench. Photos of the 9 women she had helped honor laid carefully beside her. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying memories of the past and whispers of hope for the future. She reflected on how far they had come. Victor Hale had been brought to justice, families had closure, and the foundation had become a beacon of hope nationwide. Yet Sophia knew the work was never truly done. There were still unsolved cases, still families waiting, still questions to be answered. And she was committed to answering them, one case at a time, one family at a time. Her phone buzzed, a text from Maria, another match, a 1986 case in Portland, Oregon, a family waiting 40 years for answers. Sophia smiled, her heart lifting. Another family would finally know the truth. Another story would find closure. Another life, long silenced, would be remembered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the park, Sofia Delgado rose. She looked at the cherry blossom trees, at the lives they represented, at the countless families whose pain she had helped ease, and she knew the mission was clear. The Clara Donovan Cold Case Foundation was not just an organization, it was a movement, a promise that no victim would be forgotten, and that justice, no matter how delayed, would always find its way. The journey of remembrance, resolution, and reform that had begun in a small Riverside apartment nearly 50 years ago had blossomed into something far greater. The shadows of the past were giving way to the light of action. And as Sophia walked away from the park, spring's first blooms beginning to dot the landscape, she knew that Clara's legacy, like the cherry blossoms, would endure, inspiring hope, justice, and change for generations to come. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.